Live.
Hello.
Ulang sin. Let's go kang YouTube akan kanin. Awesome.
Enid. Hello, Enid.
Hello, oh, kasi thế
kan chân đôn thấy đôn tụi em.
Oh, chân thấy chép to ang.
Cái rốn số nó chân chú. Cái internet connection here stable low lúc tụi cái amai top lệ zuk zuk mày à. Cái tin chắc đôn lâu riêu mày.
Anh đi tập số văn giờ được về ngay rồi
Alo, chặt tao sao anh lệ alo mong mình mày à.
Tu na hianin za somriat patlai participants kan ong to kan ho tu te lam kha coordinator te kha an in ready
Yes, atran thaye.
chan
Atran thaye.
Ole acha lo shiro apu le kan 3-day national webinar kan lo chan don to anga kan thu pui kha kan shat angin Hripui le literature ti ani pandemic and literature a multidisciplinary approach kan tia chu zan ina hei kan chan thei dona participants te po kan chanem to alom om hle ni webinar chim tu zong te organizing committee Mizo Department Pachhunga University College mingin chibai kan buk chewa in hun lu tak senga he webinar ti lo ting tu in ni awangin lom in lok pui ngei po kan be sei bok ani zanina hian kan patron professor H Lalthanzara nena lom tu kan soya in keynote speaker Reverend Professor Vanlalnghaka Ralte te in kan resource person Professor Malsawmliana le Dr. Zothanchhingi te chibai kan lo puk chewa he webinar lo ti lo ting tura inin pek na te kan som na te ngai pui mo a ngemin lo pom sakawang hian lom thu kan soyani zanin hi achan tir zan ani a I program hi a chong te uhleka chuwang chuan thu tam ma shwai ka nei lo mai nga hei COVID-19 Hripui awangin kan nun phung zong a buai zoba ke ni ram mai ni lovin khobel pum pui po chunga wang chuan nge shikai phung thar zel le thi te chin te kan ngai tha chu chuang kan bil rual lu a shikyan hun kan hak hel le ni Hripui hi khobelin voi enge moza ta lo ma choni na lo pal tang to a chung chu ziak mi te tan man ro tha classic ling phak literature lo pian chuan man ro te pol pung di ve to china mishing le literature hi in chom to na ni wangin thi na te na le she omna be theina chi sang thlen tu Hripui po hi literature pian chuan na hun pui mo chak pakhat alo ni thei ve reng ani chung thu le la te chu a hun lai thil theng mi shat fia tir tu te atuar tu te din hun kan lo chong pui ve theina ani mai pia lama khan mishing su khek le khotang nu pung a thazonga kai shwai tu le zirtir tu in hnem na le be sei na mi siam sak tu ni he webinar a hian zirnama sang atangin mi thiam ten Hripui chungchang an zir chian na kan ngai thadona angai nom satya mai don lowa pinna kan char chuak nge yang ti kan ringa chim tu zong te he webinar tel zong te he zanthum o webinar hi atop khenga chim chun zom zel tu ring kan som tuna kan program angin kan lo kalanga thu soi kan ngai thanga tuna kan som tur hi he webinar atana patron le Pachhunga College principal Professor H Lalthanzara ania ani hi he webinar lo tin na turatana su tu le mi poimo kong engkima ma min shwai sak tu le min ti lo tin sak tu ni ane na hian lom tu kan soi ni Professor H Lalthanzara hi zoology lama mi thiam ania plant ecology lam hi atuina le thiam big na ni nge a kumsang ni som ni pakhat atangin Pachhunga University College hian principal na achel chana academic lama sun ro pui tak tak nga MMA research paper ro pui tak tak som ni pariat bel ziak to in Central State Sarkar Hwaya research project lian tak tak panga azofil to pokani Mizoram chan savachan china zirna Popular Birds of Mizoram ti le khapuchu kumsang ni sompali khan ti chuan ni to a thop witnen current trends of biodiversity research in Mizoram ti le khapu kumsang ni sompakhan ti chu alo ni to bok Mizoram University Hwaya hian academic council le executive council member ania Mizoram Sarkar Hwaya committee poimo tak tak state board for wetland conservation project te state board for wildlife te nomenclature committee te EFNCC department te member ani bokani tuna thu soi turin a webinar patron le principal Pachhunga University College Professor H Lalthanzara hello somang
hello me zavain masaberin chibai kabuk chuwa 3-day national webinar on Hripui literature kan han mang thei tu hi ahlim in a long ya kan webinar ti lo tura mi thiam kan ram apo kan swam kan ngai san tak tak ten hun minron spare thei tur kan riat te hian lom katm ema chuwangin hian kan resource person tele participant lu tak tak te hei a then chu ming kan en ringot po hian college kan kalai kan SU suai tu te po ka mu ni pu sang ho na ming po ka mu ni mi dang dang tin ko than rong bol na lama an hnung ka lo zui to te po ka mu a ka tiang khan tin thil danga an hnung ka zui to ming mo za tan omin ka sian nuamin alom ka ti a chi bai ka buk vek chewani ei kan hetiang program boina le mangan na har sa takkara pon po chuak thali thei lawa mi puite kan tom im laia hetiang ang mi thiam te ne na tanga har song song thei na tur thil soi ho na le ngai thak tur beng ti war tu kan nei thei na tura Pachhunga University College Mizo Department ten program an buat sai hi lom katia chuwangin department head le PNH Lalrammuani le athopui zirtir tu kan thian te zong zong chunga lom thu kasoya an boin an ha le an chunga kalom me mani tin participant zong zong te chunga po lom thu minron tel pui wang hian kan soi ve abik takin kan resource person te in pek na le an hun minron spare thei hi lom katm mani tin literature hi ami le sa lutuk chu kani lona PU science kan zirlai tangin Mizo literature hian katui ve tlat maya Pachhunga College library a khwan Mizo history te le kan literature le khabu engemot zat hi kalo chiar ve to trina BSc kan han kal te khathu le la hi ka subscribe ve a puthang lian te in ka vazong chu ka chinga venga ka poisa nei ang ka in lo na khan ka subscribe ve a ka ngai hluem em ka bai na kumtin hian ka chiara anuam hi ka tia literature ka zuk chiar to hi chuanin thil dang hi ka kama mo to lo ka ngai to lo ani china chu tiang khop chuanin Mizo literature a khan kaloin baptist ve manin ka ria ka le khabu chiar te hi an kalo ka note down ati khana list ka siama tu zia nge tu publish nge pek engza nge antikuma eng edition nge ti te kha nuam ka ti ve ma chu tiang chuanin kalo tui pui ve to hle amaro chu science lama research te kan han ti nu chuan khang kha chunzom tak tak thei talova engponi sela mishing nun chung rila hian kan zuk thiamin afila kan zuk cheng lo po ni sela voin thleng hian kanuna hian literature hian min kai suai tu le role poimo tak play tu ani renga chuwang chuanin anuam ka te ka ngai sanga hun ol ka nei phot hi chuan helam hi ka bi ka thiam ang tok le ka phak ang tokin ka bi ve thin ani ti kha kan share ve hrim du ani ti chuan zan ina kan resource person to thian pa Professor Malsawmliana kan thian pa ngoi te tin Dr. Zothanchhingi Khiangte Moderator University Samachanga kan han nei thei tu te hi lom kati abik takin Reverend Professor Vanlalnghaka Ralte punga ka kan han nena tang khan ngai thla thei tu te hi lom katia kapur to hle ni chuti lai chon thil zanin dar riata hianin web online program principal council in poimo tak mai reilo te anei lok angaya chu kan organizer te le thiam te min riat thiam kan deal kan in report loka reilo te ka chu azok angai do na amai ro chu kan zo vele ron ngai thaturin ka ron lut le ngal don ani min zawai chu he program hi lo tling taka mang tu le lo thak taka mang turin du sakna sangber kalan chu ni kalome
Professor H. Lalthanzara kan lom hle mai kan soita gang khan ani hi he webinar ta na patron ani Pachhunga University College principal ani he webinar lo tin na tura at zong le kong min sia sakna wang khan lom tu kan soinun le tuna chuan keynote kan lo ngai thadon to anga kan keynote soitu tur Reverend Professor Vanlalnghaka Ralte hi kan han soma aman lo kan ring khop maya maro chu lo ngai dam ulam kan som na te halo ngai poimo a hun chep takara hi tiang hian min lo po thia kan lom le ani Reverend Professor Vanlalnghaka Ralte hi Mizo Theological College ATC principal ani New Testament professor ani bok tiamna lama chuan BSc honors MSc BD MTH DTH ani ATC in and Watsai Mizoram Journal of Theology editor ani mek bokani Mizoram Presbyterian Church Synod Nwaya Committee le po changa member ani baka Senate of Serampore Nwaya Doctoral Studies Encol 2 Research Committee chairperson Changlai ani bokani ani na hi kan soi kim seng lobanga kha tlang pui ni mai sela ani kan han som na chan hi Hripui awangin ramin kan soita kan khan har satna to ka sa kwana le khotlang nun hi ain zom tlata mishing ri rusuk thek thunun tu le kai shwai tu sa kwana ni ani kan sa kholama kan ho tu le mithiamin keynote address min han soi sak thei tur hi kan lom le achunga hian zan ina hian organizing committee pingin lom thu kan soi nom le ani le tu na chuan keynote soi turin Reverend Professor Vanlalnghaka Ralte ilo somang
kalome hezani na hian beise lo de maya somna ka don ti lo tlin lo ni thei tu hi kalom le a bekin Pachhunga College athil thleng le hatian hoi hot na ka tel hi kalom le zuala a chan chu kumsang chu ko samsari pariat atanga samriat chung kha Pachhunga University College hian New Science kazirve chumi wang chuan Pachhunga College thil thlengte tin in chanchin ngai nom tak tak te hi kalo ngai ven thrina ten Mizoram College chuan tak tin India rama po achia chuan minglang thamte halo ni chho zel ati hian kalo lom thrina tin hei tun hun bi ka hian 3-day national webinar on Hripui and literature tin an huai hot te hi in rem hleng ka ria a huai hot tu te zong nena lom thu kan sei ngala ten he kan webinar hi lotling taka akal thena turin du sakna po ka hlan hal chewani tin zanina UC principal Professor H Lalthanzara anin min ho theya halom le zualin ka ria poni sela he kan thil ti ho tur hi ke ri tan chuan thil an sei thui thei dutuk ani lamana chen tam taka oma amaro chu kan ton tlan vek ani na zone ai ro chuan han riat ve chin te tin ri ru a lo ngai tua le lo chui dan te tin nitura thil kan du dan le kan lo suang to dan te thil tam takom ve a chung te chu he webinar a hian Hripui han en poi khan aron keng chuak aron phur chuak don lein ka ria kalo khop mai kan ria dangin COVID-19 kan ti mai novel coronavirus kan ti hian sang kum sang di som pakua top lam atang khan khovel min ti buaya amaro chu ami pui nol pui ang le tin khovel pui ang chuan kan remai lova ti chuan mars si som nei sang di som nei khan WHO World Health Organization chuan he thil hi Hripui khovel pum dap harsat na thlen tu pandemic ani ti apuanga chumi atang chuan he Hripui hi ani na ang takte riat chua tin in vena chumai ba ka chuan he Hripui hi dar zau zel lo na turata na in veng turin ramtin ruai tu te ngen na riat tir ngal chu tiang chuan ram thang thanga yang to kin he Hripui hi an machan klang ta ani enge machena chuan he Hripui hi tho khatna kan ti mai chu kami han tam tak chu til to kina lova euro bramte ngong na sa zuala tin ko thang ram kan ti US ram te war na sa khop maya india te lo lu ta maro chu kan ram khoi tu te le kan bi thiam te malak na awang te poni a enge machena ram lian le mi ring tam na kan niang ai in kan tuan salava tin Mizoram ma phei chuan kan ziom le ni ti kha kan ria chu tiang kara chuan a tho ni na an lo lan ta ka hi chuan khovela po tuan na saram te kan lo nei in a thi pui tam ram te kan lo nei a case chu kan ria casualties te po anxiety nge veya anxiety nge thi ti hi han soi poin kan soi zor rol khan zo le ngal khari kot kha chu thi le ngal ti mai tur ania amaro chu kan riat lang tho atun nai alan maidana chuan khovel pumpui hian nuai sang khat zasari vel don hian Hripui hi an veya tin nuai somthum panga chuangin an thi pui to ni ti kha kan ria tin india deram biga chuan nuai zani somsari pali chuangin an veya nuai thum chuang hretin an thi pui to ni ti kan ria ani tin tun na ya kan ria ni min lamte Mizoram din mun as zani borvelte avei kan han ani deu zak zaka nimin record khachuan ama nisari chung kha nitin mi zani somli pathumin an veizi ang khan record da ani chutiang khop chuan Mizoram po ri hi alo na sata ten athi pui po mi somthum pali lai kan lo ta ani chutiang te ni chuan kan ramina kan tur dan anamai talo le maya abikin Mizoram na chung pumpui mi han dap chua mek na tele tin aizola veng rang a himbik po amlo ti tur khopin mi lu chil na satta ka hian Hripui hi kan tan po thel na mai lo le ngai tua chian ngai tina do na konga te inven na konga te po thapui kan thole zual ngai te ni chung kara chuan tuna kan thil zir hi thil tangkai tak tur nakin zelatan po kan man chun som zel tur thu cha le kan in zir tir na te ani don lein ka ria lomom lein ka ria tin heng Hripui ang chi hi seitong khan tun ma trangin khovelin alo machon to trina BC zathum zali borvela tepo alo ti hria da ni a mi sang telina anlo thi pui to ani a ten AD ka hanti nuwa po engemo kum azabi kartla dana ten ya changina jingdewa Hripui hina satak takin khovela hian alo thop thina mitam takin an thi pui amaro chu tunang em hi chuan khovel adap ngai lo ani achan nam tak om thenga amaro chu khovel kan lo in pum khat nai zual tak wangte ten mi hringte kan lo pung ten kan in lai chin na chi rang te lo in azar zom nasale zualen tin khovel po hi alo te ta ti mayang khovel mun tin atangin khoi lai po ol sam taka khan zung ani thewang te po ni mai the chung lam chu kan soivak tur po ani in ka helova eng po ni sela he Hripui hian khovel pum puya khatiang taka mi adap suawang le ngong na sa taka nei wangin khovel economy pumpui ngong na sai be maya eile bar zonna te na sa takin ati thuan opa hei Europe ram kan hanti te ram changkang le hausa kan ti te po hi an boi ve khop maya man deu ti maila nikum kum lai hall zun tha vel khan Kolaya Mission Academy Germany an professor dena kan in biak na chuan kan program ruaman sa tam takhi kan su tangai dona chu mai ni lovin kan program ruaman zel tura po hian thil tam takhi kan pai then angai dona ni sum lo lut a hina sat takin atla ni amani atia chung churam chang kang kan ti le ram hausa kan ti te po an din hun ani mitam takinan na an chan pha ten na la von trong te point duangin an thok thelo tuna Mizoram aizola te po kan din hun po kan ria ka tiang hi ani chuwang chuan economy na satakin khovel hian alo dang lam in a thalo zongin alo dang lam chunga chuan India ram bi ka hian nikum April atanga nikum ka kum masa ani zakang chu kum masa April atanga kum khatchung kha financial year kha an han thira chuda chuan India ina income a poisa lak lu let ni 0.4 let ni lechan vede thuak hi a seng ani expenditure khan awmani chum sia he Hripui wang hian India po hian na satakin sumle pai mang ain ruam man le ain be seina aya na satak main in seng sawaniti a hriata tin chu lawa chuan heng kan sa khuana thil te hian Christian te chu kari ke mani le ke mani karin hrechiang khopa tin sa khodang zong te po nun phung kan sa khuana thil na aken thin tam ber hi ngonga Christian na chuan kan hria bikin kan in khom mathin ang te kan ti thei tak lo awang hian kan sa khonun lai mu ti mayang alang sar lai tak mai kha mu thei lo ti mayang lang chuak thei lo khapin ti khan po tomin ti dang lamin oma tin chu mai na lovin hei leng khom te paper khara lom dona khang te po kha kan Mizo Christian na chuan poimo tak mai le kan tharau nun chom tu tak pakhat ang te khatuna kan Hripui athodan kal mangai chuan anti chi alo ni talova ten heng kan ko hran nuaya po peng rang in khom pui kan han ti te committee kan ti te le kan rong bol na pa ngai ram thar fil theng poin kan ti thin pa ngai ang kha kan ti thei to lo ani chu wang chon kan sa khuana nun pum pui le kan rong bol na he hian a hong na se ema ten kan khotlang nun kan ria mizo chu nam in pum khat le nam in zom tre em mai kan ni na te le in tlo po ton tra thileng kim mai in ring tona nun in zar zom kan ni na hang te po kha to na hian a thei ta lo chu wang chon mizo nun phung pa ngai kan lo hlut em thin le kan ngai san nuam kan ti ber thinang te kan in len po na te le thil kan ti ho thin ang zong te kha aron ti thuan opin aron ti dang lam ta ma ni ina te kan tomalo ngaya ten kan in ten wang le kan in huat wang po ni lovin in nai lo te alo ngaya ten mai tuam te kut sil tam te alo ngaya chu tiang chuan kong ranga kan nun alo dang lama kan nam nun zia akha kan ni thin ang kha an ni thei ta lo rim maya chu zir tham le se ho tham akal zel na heng te hi eng tin nge kan kal pui zelang ti te po an se ho cha khom to khom maya tun na ya hei kan college kan ho tu te hian le khabu covid 19 la hian sia mang tin mizo christian te min nek tu chi rang te iziak tlang ang kan ti ke hi mizo nun revival ti mayang mizo nam nun har tharna ti han chang ten tia har sa ka ti khop maya enthusiastic te po ka chian nualin karing ngai nom khop mai chunga po chuan mizo zia mizo nun kan tiang tam tak ke mani pon kan hlut le midang pon min ngai san pui mang chi te tam tak oma chung chu tun huna hian ti thei lovin alom ta tin chu mai na lovin kan khotlang nun te po na sa takin heng thil hian a ngong ani ang pon isela khotlang nun ani mo ko ran kan nam nun ani mo tin kan chung kon nun thleng a ngong na zong te hi le lama chuan thil tangkai tak thil lok tak engemaw thil tha ron thlen tu ani theng ti rin oma kan bible po heng Hripui na sa tak chan chin te hi kan mu thina kan mu lang sar tak chu exodus bungsari chang som pali atanga bungsom pahnia exodus israel fa te ai kup ta tanga chan chua an nei don lai bor vela hri rang mai hri rap thak tak mai som zet mai lo puang akha ania khamira chua akha aropui khop mai he literature nen kan han sei fin dona kan han zia fin don hei hi thilom tak ponin kan ria ni china sei honna po seilana ni tong khan Hripui lo leng te hi thil tam tak a thazong ron thlen tu ani ve thina chungkara chuan literature tam tak thatak tak ron chau chuak tu ani kan bible te poi hi le lama khang thil du om lo takina a thlen le a hin chuaka ani israel fa te an lo dam kho chhuan na te le voin ni thlenga nam anga an din tlat theina chan hi mi thiam te chuan an chui man ni khan an rabi pakhatin rabi rual ho nena thu asai na ka ngai thaka chuan hetiang kan nam a din kho chhuat theina chan hi eng dang ni lovin tora mosia dan le khabu kan nei wang hi ani atia chu exodus atanga lo piang chuak ani israel fa te dam kho chhuat na chu an Hripui low experience an low angani an lo riat khami boruak kalzel khami ina hrin kalzel ina Exodus Israel fate ai kuptarama an changa an chuana akha khami kha an nam din kho chuana le mosia dan le khabu thutlung hlui kan ti lo pian chuana po anita ani chuwang chuan wena hian he kan webinar kan channa hian kan topic rang department rang clean rang kan clean le kan soi ho na trangin thil thatak thil duam tak alo chuakanga e kan thil ton mek hi ziakin thataka von thatin awmanga eng tiang ne kan nonang kan omang tin hengang har satna thi lo thleng le po ni sadeng tin ne kan ma chona ti hang kha tarlanin le von thatin don ani chume tan chuan he kan 3-day national webinar on Hripui and literature mang tu te zong le resource person zong te abo sai tu te du sakna sang ber kala ne kalome
ole keynote chadek mai kan ngai cha a kan keynote speaker Reverend Professor Vanlalnghaka Ralte chunga khan helom tu kan han soinon te a tuna han soite kan han ngai tak te kha ngai tua zui tur thil tam tak om thei ome kan lom le mai pungha ka lom tu kan soye tuna chuan kan resource person te kan lo som don to anga zanina hian resource person pandi kan nei dona Professor Malsawmliana le Dr. Zothanchhingi te ania ti chuan hemi ma hian announcement kan siam du lok chu I takina paper te kan ngai khak zon huwa hian zona le channa kha chat box lama khanin azo theidona amai ro chu paper pakhat ngai khak huwa ni lovin apani khan kan ngai khaputanga chumin huwa chuanin chat box lama khanin zona kha azo zui theidona ni kan resource person tuna kan hansom tur hi Professor Malsawmliana ania ani hi government ti Romana College History Department Professor ani a PhD thesis hi megalithic monuments of Mizoram a descriptive study ti ani a Mizoram chunga lungpun sang te azir chianga Mizoram archaeology abikin megalithic culture lam hi atuina le athiam pingna ani ama pual hian lekha pupali aziak to achung te chu South Sabwal chanchin ti te thuziak khan khom te megalithic culture of Mizoram le waime history kumsang hazakwa somkwa purpachanga sang di sompwa te ani a hengba ka hian zo fa ti ta na lekha pucha tak panga alo edit to boka international te national le state level te research paper enge moza de ziak to a chungte chu lekha phule journal chatak taka te chwa alo ti toni a ezon na konga le khutlanga rongbon talama tho tok rea tuna hian central waimea assistant secretary ani a kapleya memorial trust chairman ani mek boka in Mizo Archaeological Society president ani a Mizo History Association joint secretary ani meka Mizo Academic Forum secretary ani bokani hengba ka hian ni na poimo tak chela chungzinga chuan North East Zone Cultural Center Dimapura hian governing board member ani a Archaeological Survey of India via state level coordination committee on preservation and protection of monuments member ani pop ani nachel te hi soikim sen ani lowa hetiang mithiam zanina resource person kan nei the hi alom ple ani Zan ina athupui tur a paper thupui chu Hripui le Mizo literature history thirna achanga thirna ti khania pandemic and Mizo literature a historical approach ti ani ome hasap tung chuan tuna Professor Malsawmliana ilo somang
Moderator Kalome Professor H Lalthanzara Principal Pachhunga University College le keynote address petu Reverend Professor Vanlalnghaka Ralte Principal Aizol Theological College te ten zanina kan resource person pakhat Dr. Zothanchhingi Khiangte tele Pachhunga University College sa Mizo Department Institute tu te le he hun bang tu zong te ama sa in sibai kabu kachu Pachhunga University College sa Mizo Department in Hripui le literature ti tu pui banga national webinar yan bot sai hi alom le maya ten ke tak he kaloma be Sailo dewa hetenga thu seve turamilan som hi in bo sai tu te chunga lom thu ka soeni zanina ka thu pui tur hi tuna kan moderator ina soyang khan Hripui le Mizo literature history thirna tangin tiani asap trong chuan pandemic and Mizo literature a historical approach ti ani hun po kan nga hlem he minute somli lai minan pe ka paper share tur po hi ka ziak sei khop maya chuti ruarin vai chung kan share lo tura ngai ila share kan zeu te po kan ne anga tin la thu te aum dona kan share tura hianin la thu hi share full lo pal te all khop maya chunga chuan ngai thatu ten do the taka min lo ngai thak kha kan bei sei don ani ama sabera chuan la thu pakhat kan da kan thewe hridai kan thewe kan thiang lo ve local su tiani khovel chanchin kan thirle chuan tumeng amazat mitam tak thi Hripui hi khovela alo leng to thina achang in khovel pum a huap lain a thren ero huap zim jok deute anni heng Hripui leng wang hian mitam tak an thia mitam tak ramtui leilovin an chuak bok ani kan thupuin talan tumbernia lam chu Hripui leng le akai hwe wanga tule hlalo piang chuakte history tanga chuina ani mihring tan chiana na satak ani rualin heng van duina lo thleng hian tule hla tak a hring chuak ve thunga abikin BC zali somthum atanga zali somni paruk chunga 18th plague te AD za somruk panga laya Antonian plague te tin AD zabi parukna lai hola Justinian plague kanti te kum sang zathum AD chawa black death lo thengte ten sang kha ruk somruk panga sang go somruk paruka London ko puya rileng Great London plague awanga mi noi chuang an boralte kum sang go som puria tanga som hi borvela khovel kuma influenza Spanish flu anti bok leng ina tule la thatak tak ahin chuate hi soisen ani don lo ani Greek literature thujiak langsar tak pani asa prong chon two great classical 18th works anti Sophocles Salemchan zia pathum Oedipus the king Oedipus at Colonus Antigone tele thukidai sa history of the Peloponnesian war te hi BC zali somthum bora 18th plague in ahin chu langsar tak anni tunlaya no pang infiam na hla nazari rhyme lar tak ring o roses ti hla kum sa kha zaruk somruk panga London plague awanga lo chuak tele shileng chungchang helaina tarlan dan te hi angai nom le ani heng Daniel Defoe London shileng chungchang thon thu manga zia chu a journal of the plague te Catherine Ann Portalina kum sa jo som preta Spanish flu le Indo pui pakhana bechana athon thu ziak pale horse pale rider titela thil dang tam takte heng te hi khovela thule la hriat lar pol anni tun tuma hian Mizo ten kan hriat the tanga Hripui kan lo tor dan le hemi na hong chu thule la te atlang puin kan hlir dona heng thule la te hian hrileng in mihring nuna khoi dan le an tor dan te chiang takin an tar langani hetila hian Mizo chanchin history kan hlir chuan literature kan ti hian sa phoron lu malam jong ka chu la le thon thu kan folk tales te atiang te kha ani deu bera heng literature peng dang ti lem chante essay te ang chi chu alalang lem lowa Mizo tina thon thujiak kan chin tran hun te lem chan le essay kan chin tran te atlai le heng kan chin ven hwe ro chun Mizoram ma Hripui leng soitur au meu to lowa chu wangin kan thu puya hian Hripui le Mizo literature kan ti hian la hi apok deu berdon ani Laldinmawia chuan literature chu mihring thil ton le veizong ngai tuana le suang tuana hun rei tak dei theitura tong kau che dik le moi chungchuanga puan chuana hi ani ati adi khop mai ni mihring ten kan suang tuana ba ka kan nuna kan thil ton chi sang hun harsa le khir kan to te hun lim kan to te hi thule hlamangin kan puang chuak thina abikin hlamangin kan puang chuak na sa hle hun le ukal zera แห้งลาเตเลทุเจกตฮีอาหุนลายจันจินชุยนานะมันรจังกายตักอันนี้บอกอันนี้อารมณ์ขนาดส่วนกันปีพูดเตเลสิปุยจุงจางเฮียนสวยกันดูกันปีเลพูดที่ขันสิเลงเลนั่นละก็อินเทนไฟนันอินโทยนะช่างฟังอันบัวเสียทีนะนั่นน่าจะรินอินโทยนะพวกช่างเจละเอ็นตีนันไก่เลสวลโทยนันจุนเทียงอันมังน้องปังสิโลนตานอาร์ลุยเซนเลวกเตเตอันมังบอกสุดที่ยังส่วนนั้นอันโตเล็กส่วนอินโทยเจละอาทิตย์นั้นตัวนี้อันไงเนี่ยนะอินโทยนะฮีอันหลานจีนอันนี้กันปีพูดที่ขันคติหุ่นลายสีจงสีเซนตูดคู่หิบเลอดังเตลแล้วก็อินเวนดันจีนดันอันนี้สิได้เทวอันนี้สิได้เทวดาที่อาชีพเชียร์สวยดอนส่วนทุยคบมายาพลางเปลี่ยนสวยตายละอันโคเทนอมินสีอันเวชวนอันคัวสิเวอันรอนลูเหล่านั้นเลอดัลเหล่านั้นอันเราอินเวงทีนะพวกการคงได้อันเราเทวทีนั่นนี่แล้วลีนักโคเทนอมเต้นเรียนเวทีเรียนเวลอุปาเตอโปโคมาสิได้เทวจุงจางอันเรล่าเองกิมันรวมมันเฟลนัวสิได้เทวตูรินอันชัวก็ไม่ทายเอโรอันกัลเวงไงเลยวันนี้สิเวคัวเนี่ยไอ้การกว่าโรลอันเซียมาจู่เสกโรลจังคุลัมเลรัมลามาลัมสมงาเวล่าทุยชวนกงทางอันสามฝ่ายเวกะสุยอันทุ่งเพียสุยชวนโชลอันบางชัวเวกะฮาวฮุกวุนเลจูนิมเลปวนเชียเต็นอันทุนปัวระฮาวฮุกอังเทียงเป็นอันเซียมาเสกโรลบุลาอินลำเลชวนอดัมไลเทียงเบอร์ตูรินอันชุดตีระชุดเทียงเชื่อชวนมิริงเลมอันเซียมบกะทมโนเชเดเตนหักตีระอาราพักเทียงเบรินอันเจอันนี้มิริงเลมจูฮาวฮุกเลมบุลาชวนอันชุดตีระอัดเทนนันดินตีระบกะชุดเทียงอันไปเฟลเวกนัวชวนวิทยามบอลพูนจุเปงจูหันหัวมาเสกโรลเชเวลจูอปุกัวละเฮเทียงเฮียนอันชมากันเทเวสิได้กันเทเวกันเทียงโลเวlocal su zaka pakua kal jok ru anti hai hi ko then om ne na kal jok tura anti ani kha hridai an theu dan te anni a ti chuan in lama ang awan autira tiang chuan nasatakin hridai kha an theu thin ani chuan a hlom hina chuan tiau kan ma thu le hla te tin kan da a Mizo chanchina kan chui chuan Mizo kan pi pu te kha mun rang pem kolin kho chaka tanga tuna an thla kal zel te omna huna theu hian thlang tla in anin beng bela thlang tla na konga le hun rang hian hun har sa le khir tak te po an tonga achang in phai zo abo phai te tlang ram chin hil sa te ko sa in hun an lo mang thina an chena ram le lunga zir hian akhos an khosak le nun phung po adang lam ve zel aniข้าหุ่นลายก็สักดานพุ่งเล่นน้ำจีนดานเตค่ะอาหุ่นลายอันลับหัวจังยินทิลตั้มตักการเสถียรทุเรศลาฮีมีสิ่งนุนพุ่งเล่นก็สักดานตาลันจังใกล้ตักนี้ฟังอินเองจังเตียนตูนมาจันจินทิลตั้มตักการเสถียรอันนี้เสียเทจินาเที่ยวกันมาลำหุ่นอาเฮียนมิโซจันจินามีตั้มตักินอันโตเลนุนจันผ่านะสีเลี้ยงเองบอกหุ่นฮาร์ซาหันสวยตูตั้มตักเอาละวะการเสียเทจินเรอจูมิโซทุเรศลาจันจินาหลังสาตักไม่ชุดมุนใจเราชวนฉันอันนี้ทุ่งชุดมุนใจเราชวนดานจุงจ้างเฮียนอบิกินอหุ่นทัวสวยดานจิกีออกมาอันตาหลังตาอีละสวยดานจิกระดาชวนชินลุงอมลายชวกันนี่เตียสวยออกมามิโซจันชินเรียกตัวร่างเทียวเลยแล้วจุงนุ่งแต่ชวนชุดมุนใจเราชวนหุ่นน่ะกันปีเตเราเรียกชวนนั่นเนียนไงจูชินลุงมุนันอมลายเราชวนนี้อันง่ายร่างเทียวแต่สวยดานชวนชินลุงอมลายเห็นสิปุยเราเลี้ยงวักมามีตั้มตะกินรีเวนนุนนะอันจานะที่พออันจันเฮมเนี่ยนี่อาคคิงเขามีปุยจันเวทออันทีนี่โอเมเฮมิจุงจ้างฮีเตียงเย็นลาอินอันซอยตาอัดลุงทีมโคจีนอัดลุงขวดตินาทีมโคจีลุงทลายเละโดนตัวยันเลียกโซเวชิงลุงมีอมโลวังโคจงตีอุลาชินลุงขวดเจ้านี่เราอันโคเทนอมาโปชีอัดาระมีตั้มตักอันที่ตากวังอินโคลายลุงปุยเลียนตักอมเตเจ้าจูที่เทโลตัวระอันง่ายเฮตียงเห็นหาอันผัวบุกะที่เราวินคัวอมโมฟอมเราวินคัวอมโมลายันสวงลุงปุยฟอมเราเต้นอมนางไอเฮงหาที่อันหัวชุดบุญใจตีนอันสวยตามิโซลาจิงอุปเบอร์เนียงไงอันนี้เฮสิเลนลาเฮียนราติปะประคัดชีวินตัวจูชมที่น่ะเบงเนมายอันโคลายชวนลุงปุยเลียนตักไหมอันรวยพวกสาวตักไหมเฮียเอามาพวกช่วงจูอินคมคมนานอันมังทีนะเราแต่ปานตัวเบงเชียงลุตุกจูบินดังอิน ngai theilowin puk chungam lai chuan an chin hana athita ani anti tin soidan chidang le chuan thut mun zai lo chu hun hi pubilal thang le chuan kum sang khal zanga edi borvela run kum le than tlang in karvelan omlai thing pui tam lo thlen hun lai khani in an soi ve thunga he ti hun lai thing pui tam huna hianin free alenga tlangram chim chia thaile bu po atha thelo na mun anian khosak na mun hi ele baran harsa hemi wahen an eichiat lutuk chungei lowin Hripui alenga tarla le pangchau ni lo nula tlangwa tam tak an thia ara phlak le ani chutianga lungai le khorom lai chu nemna lan puwa thun mun zai alo piangta ani in an soi ve bok ani mitam takin nunna an chana wangin khomun nuam le ele barzun o samna jok zongin mundang an mana chungta chu hlai nan choi zela katual lenna sumtuala chul mo e lamang en mo tange chingkol kallai kan rel tin heng ha te hian anan pu ani ubilal thang lian ngai dan hi Dr. Ariel Thanmo e point apom pui bok ani thun mun zai then khatte an chiar chole tela keni riak kan fam lo milai an fam zoe milai an fam zoe lai kuma thing renge tiang chi da thil tam takoma henga hianin Hripui awanga an thina an lungai na tam takha an cham chuak ani thun mun zai ba ka hian wan chunga chuan mithi zai om thu ata lang boka thing tam lai hian an thina sa hle a chuta an lu su na le lungai na puan suana hla chu ni in asoi tlangwal ruang te a thi chu anula angai zong in aruang chunga hla apu a chu hla chu mithi zai tin an soi zuita a an hla ser ber ni in asoi mithi zai hi nupa in ngai zong tang thena cholo chuan an sangai lo an ti hial heng he ani mana ero fam masa tu hremo thir khim lovin trin mo runa rem le lai chin unaw nei lovin jing rume ka thin jing rume kanu ti om lo ka pa ti om lo ka thin jing rume ti hla kha ani a mithi zai hi amalama kan suita khan thut bun zai nen achu hun hi ainang le maya chuwang chuan thil thumun tepo ani mai thei bok ani tin thing pui tamin chai hlar on thing chuak nia soi aum boka kesi van ha ka chuan run le trio in kar on mlaya thing pui tam awanga mitam tak an thia khuan ro san nuwa chai hla hi lo chuak ni in asoi boka chai hla ma sa jinga thing pui tam tlak chungchanga mar ho la lui lo pui hla kan mu chu atela o ye san ko len puratla mi razat lan thiare alam dan hi ka thiam chi lo mai thia dik mai lo dik theilo adik lo mai thei boka o ye chung pathian in san juk siame san ko lungang ngirna e san ko drama tlak thu soina ani adot le chuan tiau kan nu lom thumna chuan tiau kan nu le sap ho lo lan ma in kar hun tiang kan an soi le a Mizo chanchina hian kan pi pute thangtlang nu le tiau luen kan nu Mizoram sap horon lu ma si lai vela hian Hripui awanga harsana to thu mu tur auma abi kim Mizo nampeng sang zinga chak chuak namten Hripui an tor thu le hem chung changa hlapo engama zat an phua tu kan hua claim han soi zui ta ila chin hill satangin chak chuak namte hi tiau lui kanin thang an ta zela Mizoram hun sanga anom nu in engama zat chu khothlang tui pui ka des rama sajuk phaya ate o beng bela sajuk lui phai vel hi leilet zol ram tha em mai ni a sajuk phai hi coming lowin sajuk lui kuam phai vel soina ani elai tlang dong ko pakhat zinga chipui khuwa oma sajuk lui nar train mar join ke in nithum ni level kal ni in pulal dawa chan mari chuan asoi ani helai boran omla hen sa tama e bar zona ol sam ema sai po an kap de uren thian neome chutianga chipui la sajuk phai nuam tak le zalen taka anom lai chuan Hripui aleng ka hlau maya mitam tak an thia thalai le no panglam phei chuan an tuar na sa zual ani ome hemi chung chang hi hla in an phua hetengin thlang hri omlai nol tuyang lo lian van noiron fange len moi tur zong thla an fam zoe tin hetenga chakchu howin Hripui an tur ta chiam le an thabar tu hnemin khalthang pasal tha pakthanga chuan hla an pu be thunga hetengin in lung hlaumon nu chun tling choi rum som kan thung ni ne kor khopui zong an sai zo ro ti in chutianga Hripui an ve ta ka wang chuan anom na lai vel chu a phai lutuk ni in an ria a tlong chak lama trai nan thria Mizoram lama anon le ta ani sajuk omna sajuk lui hi namdang chuan tun thleng hian bara harina tin an lama Mizo chuan sajuk lui ti in tun thlengin an lamani he lui hi mar para le longkor inkar kheta nar nin chimlam hoina luanga India le Bangladesh in rina boundary international boundary nin akam phai chu leilet mun zau tak ani a history kan hudan chuan chakchu khowin Bangladesh phai zol an lu thak hi kum sang kha sari somthum atanga sang kha zariat edi inkar borvel kha ni in alang ani helai borvela Bangladesh dagong hill trucks laili le marlam Rangamati district borvela hian raza chaltu khupa lal alal line ko chaklama train chakchuak nampol yan tak an pem thla a raza chaltu khupa chuan anumna turin tlang sang longkorte vai mi ti te sakor bok chi ti te lungchir bi ti te kha arua man saka anni hoina anlo soi vedana chuan chakchuak ho chungchanga ma se anni ho hian aram borok chu an ngei lowa lum anti em boka andam theilowa anti a ti chuan tlong chaklama anin son chuak le ta ani helai borvela chakchu ho hun level hi kumsum sari borvel ani ome alom thumna chuan Mizoram sap lolan hun nu tin kan soi vele a heta hian Mizoram sap ho anon lu nu hian akha tokin rampum hriat thamle mun jim jok dewa te rileng hi hriat tur om chho tareng maya atlang puin han soi ta ila hei hi ka chiar vek lawang ka chi ka jia hi chu amar chuan soi thok tu kanga kumsang khazare somruka th lewin puthang lian chuan Mizoram chimlama omten Bangladesh chidong hill trucks kasalong anzugrun tumin zong khi anon kai ho thu aziaka heta hian mitam tak an thi thu aziak boka tin sang khazare somruk ta mau tam voi khatna Mizoram lo thlen thu te mitam tak an thi thu te soilan ani boka sang khazare somsaria hian chidong hill trucks sa Mizo nam pakhat khumi namjinga zong khi ave an len thu te le mitam tak an thi thu te hemi chungchanga an hun man dan te anin songbol dan vel te po kanan sia kamaro chu kan chiar vek lo tura ngai la ten Mizoram violent voi di tum ni sang khazare somsari pakhat sari ni le sang khazare somret poko somkwa borvela sa pole an thui hroi rong kal ti khan tui hri te malaria ten ron keng boka chunga chun an mani mi le sa po tam tak an thi thu kha alang boka ten sang khazare somret pakhat rian nia thing tam alo thlenga e hi mau tam ai main an tur jok ni in alang boka heta hian an soidan chuan khothen khata chuan chung ko khata mi thi zo vekte ten dil tama wanga chung ko mulum te po anom ni in an soi bokani het mitum hian mitam tak kachar lama an tlan thla a tramre nuwa anon let le a chu chuan tui hri anon hon le bok ani ten sang khazko panga sang go paruk akhan Mizoram khotlang Tripura ram chunga Mizo temna jampui tlang dunga hri alo leng boka heta hian tui hri ani a mi za chuang an thia anlal raza do khuma Sailo ani a ichuan athon hina mi somli vel an thilea nasatakin an tuarani tin san ko panga hian khandai phulen khuwa hianin hri aleng boka heta hian mi somsari vel an thi boka hei hi anan soidan chun heti anlaya anlal van phunga hian Christian te atidu da nasahle maya he hri lo leng hi van phunga hianin Christian howin ramhuai antithin ura khothar kai vat turani atia ti chuan khothar an kai ta hial ngeng ani chu rileng chu Christian te wang ni in asoi ani tin hemin huwa hian Mizoram zong fi kan ti hiaron leng le ta zo sam go pare ta te san zo som patuma te aron leng chhota a ti chuan a don le kan soi le du chu san go som pakhata mau tam tum hi na akhan saju apuang tawak sin bu ase zo wangin Mizoram huna tram mun frang franga trampui atla a mitam takin ei turan nei lowa bu ei zo tu saju le ran nung dangte minglam chuak mewin marlam na phu thiam lai thang pu chuan heti hian an phu chuaka kan song fang chun rol ring zo tu zu chang le zong pit te kiwa mo hriama chungleng huiwa mim sri kut kut ti in an phu a mau han tama ran nung chi sang sang ran nung chi khat thangdar thangnang an puang ta chiam boka khuain an khonga chomya tante an kang thina la pu thiam oi thang pa chuan heti hian an phu chuaka ลันไลเส้นไม่เลี้ยวอีแล้วลมนี่ทั้งเนมตลานละบวงก็ปุยลัลโอยนุนหาวไลเซียลเกียงโคงเชตีนอันผัวเวเลจัดบกะชวนมาวตามาบวงระมาจงเราตาเวกมาอะชูปอยตีไม่ให้ตีเห็นโอยทั้งป้าชวนนาอันผัวเลยอะกันเรียวสวลิมาช่วงโลบวงก็ตุกรำทั้งเตียงไพ่ปูละมารัวอาจังเจ้าลัลดังอปุยเบอร์ไม่ตีนอันผัวเลตาอันนี้ทั้งนังสุดทิ้งเลมากุงอาเตอันฟุตบอลทัวเจล่าทิ้งนาเตอันเอกลเวลฟุลมายาให้ตีเห็นหันช้ำเจล่านังมาออร์วังทั้งริมเชียริมตุยสีเหลากลางมารัวโดนไล่ทลายฟอมตีเรเส้นไม่ตรงสีเหลาอารมณ์เรรูตีนโอยทั้งป้าเฮียนินอันผัวอันนี้เต้นมาตามโดนาทั้งนังรอนกวงวักจุงจางฮีหลายทั้งปุยปุ่นให้ตีเห็นอันช้ำช่วงเวบกะทิ้งแต่ตัวโคมทีรินเฮร์เลียเย่คอยนูนสวงลุงวงทิ้งอันเริ่มเชียร์เฮียเน่ไซริลทีร์เตเนน่าบูร์เล่ละมาตามวางินไอตัววางะไวบุพูระลงายะขดินมายาลัลเล่อุปาเดชูบอร์ซับเนี่ยนะไวบุเดลินันวีร์บอยมาโอยทั้งป้าชวนบอร์ซับเฮร์ฟินันตินอาชิมกัวจูอุยรวิวจุงินซับอาเปะมุเลเล่โดนเหล่านี้นางายะอาฟปาบูรัลตาโอยทั้งเน้นอเตะขีน่าเหตียงินโอยทั้งทลฟัมเล่ดาร์ชิมกัวตนนี้เลี้ยงโมวายังทำพูจิงสุนันทั้งวาลเรียงสุมตัวละเตียนี่ให้เตียงเฮียนเมาตามวางตามปลากเลยสิเลงวางอินละตั้มตักกันเราในผาตามิเจ้าทุเรศลายมาอสอนผาเล่อันนี้ให้เตียงเมาตามวางตามปลาเล่ฮาร์สันฮิโซรัมปุนเดือดทัวหัวบลายสิเลงจุยวางมิทิ้งที่นักเลงรถจูรำชุงเจ้าจกหัวเล็มละวะคอยไล่เบียร์จิมจกอาเตมอเลงรำพุ่งหัวปะหันบอยลุยอ่างสิเลงวางทีขาตั้มอันนี้เล็มละวะนี่กลุ่ม3ก็ส่งเปลี่ยนโนเวมเบอร์ถ้าเขาเวลปุ่มHripui อารมณ์เลงจู่อินฟลูเอนซ่ากันตีสเปนิชฟลูกันตีข้าอารมณ์นี้เฮ้ยเขาเวลHripuiเลงก็สเปนเล่ที่ปอนตั้มเบอร์นะอันนี้ตั้งปุยจู่หันสวยตาอิละ USA 3ก็ส่งเปลี่ยนดิปุยไลน์สิไปจิงอันบุตรนะอีชวนอากุมเลียเขาเวลปุ่มดัดโชตาข้านี่เขาเวลปุ่มมีมักตัวด้วยสมงาเวลันที่นี่จู่Hripuiจู่มิโซรามาอารมณ์ลูดเวตาอินโดปุยปะขันน้ำซาfriends รัมตัลเตอนุนหัวสิไปเตมิโซสิไปเตอีชวนไอโซลามัวละบอร์ซาพวินมัวนะหุนอารมณ์นะหุนอันบัวเสียHripuiเลนมาลุกขันนี่ให้มีนวลหัวดับนัวเฮียนHripuiเลงตามีตั้มตักชวนอันพัวโปเข่งมันลวินรำนัวเตหุนเองมุเชนอันมังอันนี้ติชวนให้มีจุงจามปุยหันอัตลังปุยหันสวยตาอิลาสิไปหอยนันเวมาซาติเตนี่ก็ตามีปลีปังอาเตอันที่อันบอยตักเมียวอันนี้ชวน3ก็ส่งปกัวกลุ่มชุงเล็กเฮียนมุนปุยขั้วเฮริปุยวางเฮียนมีสมทุมจวงอันที่มันนี่ทินทริปุระจำปุยตลางดวงบุกเฮียน3ก็ส่งปริหันจงเฟียวางเลยอินฟลูเอนซ่าวางอินพูดดุงใส่ขั้วมีสมงาอินอันที่พะมิโซรัมกุศลขบุงบอลเวลาพวกกุมสารโจสมเนี่ยHripuiเลนทุเล่มีเองมาซาดอันที่ทูเรียดอันนี้อันกุมเล่นกะขวาขดทาร์อันกายทูเรียดอันนี้บอกอันนี้เหตุอย่างนั้นมิโซรัมหุ่นฟังสารโจสมเปรสสมประกวดHripuiเลงโพเฮียนกันโลตัวเวนัสมายาที่ปุระจามปุยตลางก็สิเลงบิเฮียนทูร์จุยตาอีละเหตุอย่างกุมสารโจสมเปรตจามปุยตลางต้องเฟียเลียนตักเชี่ยมาวางเฮียนอันลัลเทนมิโซรัมบอร์ซับเนี่ยนะรีพอร์ตอันเปอันนี้นะซัมกาฟโนนเนี่ยนะอันเปชงเลยAssam ga chon Tripura British political agent hena ape chong le chu chon Tripura Maharaja hena ape chong le ta ni chu tianga anen kheng ma selo Mizoram Assam te nena anan pe koi nuwa Tripura Maharaja in atopa reporter kheng chu mai hi angai thiam lawa chu wang chuan Tripura Zampuya Mizo Christian ho kha no chua thu ape ta niชุดที่ว่าคริสเตียนเต็นหุ่นทิมเละตีดูดานะโนชัวนะอันโตชัวลาเฮียนและพวกเทียมเสียมเลียนะอารอนหลังเวตาอันนี้ชวนชุดที่ว่าหุ่นฮาร์ซาริงตูเตตีจากนั้นเนี่ยขโมยนาตานนัดเดียวไหมเอาพวกชัวกาจู่อิรัมตุงดิงตูรินลัลปาอิตลันซาเตสวลบอยตาฟวยชวกตูรินสวลรัลเลียนเตดาวเลตูรินกันซามเซลทรีนเอมานูเอลมาช่วยเลโรตีเตมานาซิรตีเตอิทัวมังคาน ithara win min thuam langin rinin email moi min mu tila lomin bing kan fak leang ti te tin atopa rala liane setan rala liane min veng che iram chan lovin ti te kha ani a he hla hian jam pui tlang dunga Hripui awanga harsanan to le ring tu te na harsanan to kara ring tu te atha atimong em ani tin he mituma Mizorama aizol Mizoram chunga chun ser chip le kan hre dang hriang tuinek huai buang khuaten an tuana sa hle maya hengi chu han soi vek lo taila an tuana sa zia chuan ser chip khua hian he mi kum sans ko som le pakwa chowa hian January thla chu mi som ko pariat in nunna an chan ani tin hriang tuinek a hian mi zathum somret in an thi pha hengi chu chiar tur tam takoma kan soi thui lo tura ngai ta ila ta kan soi zu phata chu indo pui pakhat na nu chi marama mizo kho pakhat tlang koi khwa hria lenga ta hen patling mat po som chuang zet an thiani chu hrilenga wanga har sanan to chanchuak turin pathian an zonga khobunga pathian thu oinom ti an hria ringtu ni andu thule pathian thu anmomo thu anzu khrila khobunga chuan chumiang chuan kumsang jakwa som pakwa January tha khobunga tangin tirko ban kuwe te putun hiam atele na po thiam pu pate ate anan thok chuwa pathian thu an thrila ko ran po ading ngalani tlang koi khuwa hian an ko ran diamond jubilee puala an la po chu hetiang ani eta hian ala thu hi ami kan tong bang ngai nilawing ama an tong man ani a kan pa pasian I khuwa thimnak muna ti te ni awai chu kan chiar lowanga he la hian tlang pui khuwa in Hripui awang hun thim an to thule chumia tanga pathian thu an lo hriat chodan kha antar langani chuwang chuan he la thatak mai hi hri na aron hrin chua ani bokani ti chuan kumsang go som ni pariat a solenga sentur hri aleng vak maya heti lai Salvation Army foi tu laro huna fa te pandi chu sentu da wangin an boral lo mai boka anni chau ni lo win he hrilenga wanga harsana tok tam tak hi anom bokani chu tianga ni lai chuan na pu thiam lai thangpuya aron langa lai thangpuya chuan sentu awanga thi te sunan le an khuhar nemna tan na mai apo hel na hi tu ne pokan na saklar ani a khungrualan trinna wanduai kan room trana hian kom har lungai chum lo jing ang lalpa ka ngai don e mache wanduai minom puila iram thiang lim thleng nima se leimi hrin chung hian ka ngai thiam lo kalal lung dem tur har min don puiro ti hla thatau mai tun thlenga khuar la atana kan laman hi aron pho chuak ta a hela hi solenga sentur hrileng awanga mi an thi na awanga ron pho chuak ani ti chuan soitur tam tak awmanga a lom top lampang hi kan nai to mai nga COVID-19 Hripui lo len nu tin kanan soile a kumsang ti som pakwa kum top lama kovel ram chen khat China tangin Hripui coronavirus COVID-19 tia soi chu alo leng chana akum le sang ni som ni February March sovel tangin kovel hun rang adara Mizoram apo kumsang ni som ni March thla tangin voin thlengin he Hripui hian minan na chia pia kovel mi puitam takin an thi pha mizo jinga po engmaza tin an thi pha to bok ani hetianga Hripui lenga wanga hun thim kan ton lai hian ele barzun tonga te harsana kan to ka ko rana kal lei theilowa zirna in akal lei theilo boka mi tinten mani sahimna zongin mani na kan tom tavek mai ni hi hetianga Hripui wanga kan in khar khip chung hian la chau nilo thuziek rang apung na sa hle a mitam tak in dia thol kan nei de lom bok nen thule la thatak apung le ani hengte Hripui awang kan tona lam hoi ani kherlo na in Hripui na angong chua ani a chung zinga chin chetlak pani khat hantar lang ta ila athome covid Hripuin na thatak tak rin suate han soita ila Hripui awanga hasana kan to tele kan tona te mi puinun phungin thak thleng chungchang te la in mitam takin an puang chuaka chung zinga hlaleng long thade mai kan mo chu han chiar kan duwa he la thu hi ahlim om ve hrim boka coronavirus bangin kan phun kan zale thinti la ani a hei hi YouTube pa awmangai thak tur a phu tu le sa tu hi PC a tia ni a aming takhi ka chiang ta chialawa chamang izal kazal anzal ring mai curfew anti lai tual len aremlo nun phunga buai kan ang kan phun reng mai kan ti thei tok lai khum kan bel tlang aw reng mai curfew ti lai tual len phallo chuaruk tumla bolo an pil zeu hei ha hui ha kan ne tlange nu naw an phun patling an bang bik lo pitar putar nulat langwal chenin mel khiat ngai lo Hripui len wang hian mo suak lei lo hian kan zal le trin ilung chu leng ma se nang chu lo leng su o i khwa chu har ma se fam khwa ilu pui long Hripui le curfew hi handai te phot mai sela chin lem om lo reng in kan lain kom le donia ti te khania adang poilom nola hela hi a thave riu mai ngai thak pon a lim oma UT ba chuan an en na sakhop mai hetinga Hripui min chim awanga har sana kan tola hian zai thiam TBC zai than puyan pathian hla thadeu mai min chang ram ro ti aron pu achom boka hei hi sakpo a lo khop maya hela hi Hripui awang kan tona ti top tura pathian au na hla ani a Hripui hlom leng wangin mo ko vela dam lo meke angui ruaye khwatin thlertin thlap hangin o kan rume engchen nge mo ni zel don lalpa kian zai real tir to la atok lom ni imi te tong tran hi chang don to em le lalpa imi ten ilam kan lo hoi min chang ramro imi ten ban pharin kan awache ten soi mai ha lo tur pakha chu laldanga zai thu ka COVID-19 a sang lueti kulal ming moi ralte siam hi ani a hela hi athukin azir boka sakpo no maniang UT pa po limpui hle maya COVID-19 oi sang lue khovel ram tin tlang tin fang vela rum vong vin o ram tin siam vele oi ana ti khania thui khop maya ngai thak pon wam khop mai heng lak an talan ba ka hen Hripui awanga torna puan chuana hla pathian fang na hla le la leng long te la cham mi te engma zat achuaka talan vexen ani lawang hla chau ni lo thon thu le thuziak engma zat Hripui leng le kai hoi chungchang talan le in khokir na wanga ron chuak om buka chungzinga pani khalan ta lang le ta ila nikum sang ni som ni khan central way mele AIE tangkop te chuanin thon thu in phu siak abot saya hei ti siak na hi Christian tlangau bu chuanin Mizoram thuziak manga inti siang na to te zinga lo tling bera chalngam ti in asoing heng ni hemi tum hen thon thu zanga somli pathum aziaka en diktu tan po en manhla thamani a heng zinga thon thu thajwal som hi la chuakin lomman siamani a abu in ti chuani tungcho ti abu minga phuani a central way mena buina te chuaka chung thon thu som de chu ruizen sen ti telal biak nia ruat bala chan chuak tu domi dot moiber holha bok kha riat reng bu pasal tha te saljo than sangi ton mang su nu ti te ani a heng thon thu zanga somli pathum kan ni that te hi Hripui leng ina a hrin chu tak meu anni adang le chu Mizoram University English Department malang nine writers workshop Kolkata in sang hi somni anti chu lockdown literature from Mizoram ti hi ani a hei hi a lukhop ma sap tonga ziak ani a hemi bua hian ziak mi som ni pani in poem somnga panga le thu ziak luang prose panga anti chuka atlang puin hen thu ziak te Hripui leng chanchin an ni a an thu puya chon behind locked door ti te pandemic jam ti te the virus king laugh in a time of sea lockdown isolation COVID-19 hand washing or to the mask le dang ti te ni a khang kha he le khabu lockdown literature from Mizoram la le thuziak te an ni a atupui tang po hen Hripui leng ina hrin suwa ti alang chiang le ani ichuan Hripui leng le Mizoram tharau thinglim harna chungchang hi toy te han soilan le kan duwa Mizoram sa phoron lu nu le Christian sa ko kan von tak nu a hian rampum ho pathil thleng chi rang in dot chota zut maya heng zinga chin chia tlak deu chu Hripui len nu lo ka tharau thinglim harna lo thleng zel thin hi ani amalama kan talan tongin kumsan go panga cho Mizoram mun engemaza ta Hripui lenga mitam takin nunnan chana khoengamazat an ro sana khothar te an kai pha a bun then ta phei chuan heng hri te hi ring tu Christian te wanga u thleng ne ngai na te po awm bok ani kumsan go som bok ta Mizoram puma ma otam khan ko than po an ngui le maya limna thong po engma om theme lo a hemi chungchang hi reverend liang khai chuan he ting hena ziaka rampum puima vai bu purin sai rang ti poimu ka te tlabunga te anjin mur mai ni limna thu chu asoi thei meu talowa mautam nulama kha chuan ko than kha angui ta ani deu ber mai tren khatin harna kan ngai hle to rengani tin asoya ichuan sans ko som pre som ko harna voi ni na harna voi thumna alo leng le ta ta chuan hemi chungchang appoint ko ran an lo ngui le maya reverend liang khai buk chuan heti henan siamani an ziakani chutia lu sun ko har tam kum sa jago som pakwa July ni somdi paruzana chuan ni sapuya lungleng kiang zotlanga le thingsaya arwal thatin harna nasadeu mai alo thleng tareng maya kan lusun khohar min nem turin pathian in tharau min ron pe ni hi kan tia kan lom emani ti in aron ziaka reverend liang khai hianin Hripui awanga ko than kan ngui lain thianin tharau thilim harna aron thlenta ani ti in asoeni hetianga ramina trampui mithia to lai le tharau thiang lim harna lo thleng cho rual zel mai hi amak le maya he hun lai hi mizo te zia christian na al cho hun lai ani thileng awin tu te anmang anga pathian an auna sa hle ani reverend liang khayat hirnang chi hen reverend lalchuan ena chuan ahun lai borok hetiang hian athir boka Hripui awanga tuana chuan ko thlan mi te tharau lam nun chu a khoina sa hle mi then khatrin na konga nungtol anom line mi tam takson pathian an nai pha ve thunga heng mang an na sa tak tanga ring tu te tong tai na chu pathian in changa kum sa ja ko som ko lai hol vela harna tum thumna aron thleng le ta ani ti in reverend Lalrammuani hian asoi bok ani hetianga ring tu te nun aboi em lai hian pathian na tho alo la pathian la tak leng khom la te alo piang chuka harnaina ron ring chuak ta heng la te san pain heng la te hian a san pain Hripui leng awang har san an to thu an ta lang kher lowa ma se an hun tonin nasa takin na po tu te ril ru ngong anei nin alang atlang komna toite hetiang hian kanan siama atirlama kan tarang tang khan mizo te chanchina hun masalama chuan Hripui leng hi hriat turom zewa heng hrileng in mizo mi puite ati boidan le mitam takin nunna an chandan te na thu tangin kan hre thaya kan pipu te khan an hun ton sang te kha la in an thril zela heng la te hi chanchin lui chuinan thil tangkai tak an ni chota zel boka mi hring nun nai na tor ni ma se heng Hripui leng sang awang hian thule lat tak kan nei pha vele thung ani hei hian nasa takin mizo literature ati hau sakpa chu wangin mizo literature zirna le chuina konga hian he Hripui leng te hian mun poimo tak an nu ani kalome
Miss voice update mai
min lo ngai dam ro I copy per thade mai kan ngai tha Professor Malsawmliana chunga lom tu kan soya Mizorama Hripui leng sang man laya changa bo in thlengin chipchar tak te kim chang takin angong chwa thu le la te nen kan han ngai tha history le literature in khung kai dan te literature thu le la te hi historical document poi mo tak alo ni dan te ngai nom tak beng war tha tak tha usoma chunga khan lom thu kan soi ni le kan soi ta kang khan in zona le chan na hun kha kan hong shi don lova tuna hian resource person pakhat kan la neya chu Dr. Zothanchhingi ania kan somma in puan tur ngai chul poimo te hi kan soi lokanga e certificate kha du kan om chuan feedback form nakina azan thumna kan laron tar lang dona kha lo fill up turani feedback form du tan khan tuna chuan ka comment vak lo mai nga hun hi chon de ule ka bangin han soi zui chak po ka neya amai ro chu ka soi zui vak lo mai nga tuna hian zanina ta na kan resource person nung zok tur Dr. Zothanchhingi kan somanga Dr. Zothanchhingi hi Moderator University English Department zirtir tu ani head of department na po alo chel toni tuna hian Moderator University Center for Women's Studies coordinator and the in seminar proceedings home na le khapu chatak tak orality, quest for meaning, critical inquiries into contemporary thoughts, Wittgensteinian philosophy of religion, orality in Northeast India, low edita and boka International Journal of Literature and Cultural Studies ayan Chief Editor of Transcript animek bokani tuna hian Tribal Literary Forum of India Joint Secretary Natil Meka International Society for Folk Narratives and Research member ani boka a research paper te hi lekhapu le journal shanga chwa to ania national le international level la speakers ni in thupui poimo tak tak alo soito ni akai shwaina nwaya hian MPhil pakhat de PhD pali an chuak to a tuna hian Northeastern Hill University Cultural and Creative Studies Department visiting fellow ani mek bokani zanina athupui tur chu literature shin chuak tu Hripui pandemic as a source of literature ti ania ani hi tuna achanchin tlang pui kan han soi angkhan Mizoram tlem le a chuwang chuan sabchong ne na aron pol nok makani po khan aleng takani ti kha lo sheta ila ani po in khashung lo sela chuwang chuan Mizo chong le sabchong adu zok adu le ahman polanga khatiang khan zalen taka hun mang turin kan somani tuna Dr. Zothanchhingi lo somang
PNED kalom MMA in should him
kan shetheye atyang kop mai
achatsu atyang lo le sina kan action hit one atyang lo tan lo shidula into ma te kan so ngai mi one atyang lo tan lo shidon dia PNED Professor H. Lalthanzara, Professor Malsawmliana, organizing committee member Shang Khiangte, le participants Zothanchhingi invite to
voice off, but let me miss.
Ashar Petro.
di khana shetheye
So yeah, okay, then without much ado, the current say Shallow Lana current say Zokhato is Atlang Queen sub English Kahmanga Tuani Mizo Trongboka a low policy Bokan Tum Zelanga Tuanin Saprong Shevek in his hoti coming Shilkani organizers the Kani Napoilo Turalongaila. So without much ado, let me start with tonight's talk. Since I have already been given the topic of discussion as pandemic as a source of literature. From Homer to Boccaccio to Daniel Defoe to Albert Camus, pestilence has been a source of great literary work. Stories about pandemics over the course of history of Western literature gave much in the way of a catharsis, ways of processing strong emotion and political commentary on how human beings respond to public health crisis. Homer's Iliad, as we all know, opens with a plague sent by Apollo on the Greek camp at Troy as punishment. In the Iliad, Agamemnon held in captivity the daughter of Chryses, Apollo's priest. Chryses asks Agamemnon for her return, but the haughty king refuses. The old man appeals to the god whom he has served all his life, and Apollo, angered by such disrespect, shoots the arrows of plague at the Greeks for 9 days. I quote, with a face as dark as night and his silver arrow rang death as he shot his arrow in the midst of them. Only after the girl is freed and suitable offerings made to Apollo does the pestilence end for the Greeks. The 14th century classic Decameron, which was published in 1353 by Giovanni Boccaccio, is set during the bubonic plague pandemic, also known as the Black Death, that raged over Afro-Eurasia from 1346 to 1353. So we will discuss this work later on in the talk. In fact, I will not be in tonight's talk. I will not be discussing about the statistics because that has already been pointed out by the keynote speaker, who H. Lalthanzara. So I will be dealing straight with literature, how pandemic has become a source of literature, and I shall be examining especially four literary texts: Decameron by Boccaccio, which is in fact known as the 14th century Italian classic, and Journal of the Plague Year, which is written by Daniel Defoe, published in 1722. Then I will also be dealing with one of the most popular, piece of fictional work written by Bram Stoker, published in 1897. And of course, finally, I will also be talking about Albert Camus' work, which is one of the most significant works of what we now call pandemic literature, which was published in 1947. Am I audible? Okay.
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, thank you. Now, before going into that, let me mention a few texts, which has been very significant in this list of pandemic literature. Mary Shelley's apocalyptic novel, The Last Man, which was published in 1826, cannot be ignored. But of course, I will not be, talking about that because of the post-apocalyptic novel written by Mary Shelley is the first of the apocalyptic novels ever written, and it was published in 1826. And this novel was set in a futuristic Britain between the years 2070 and 2100 in future. And this novel tells the story of the protagonist Lionel Burney, who becomes the last man following a devastating global plague. Well, the book was not received very well during the time of its publication because the readers that time, that was in the 19th century, early part of 19th century, were not receptive of such dystopian witness pandemics and wars with the two world wars. The novel has gained much popularity since the 20th century. A Journal of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe, published in 1722, is a long, detailed narrative of events, anecdotes, and statistics regarding the Great Plague of London of 1665. And this is one of the few texts that I will be discussing in detail. And what makes this work most enduring and true all times is its account of human reaction in times of distress. Such line found in this work, as I quote, innumerable stories also went about of the cruel behaviors and practices of nurses who tended the sick and of their hastening on the fate of those they tended with their sickness, unquote. Now here Defoe talks about who were employed to tend to the sick, In his 1722 book, let me remind you once again, in 1722, and we were talking about the 1655 play, it offers us a grim side of human response to the health crisis. But in the 21st century, this scene is startlingly familiar, even in the contemporary pandemic writings, one of which I would like to mention, that is from Arundhati Roy's essay, "The Pandemic is a Portal," which was published in April 2020 in the Financial Times. I will quote, who doesn't remember the videos of patient dumping, sick people still in their hospital gowns, but naked being surreptitiously dumped on street corners? She was talking about the American healthcare. And she continues, I quote again, "Cancer patients driven away like cattle with AIDS in Delhi having been turned over for the service of the virus," unquote. And here she was talking about the handling of the pandemic in India. Of course, literature cannot give a cure for the disease, but it sure can offer us a window into the deepest recesses of the human mind and how people react and interact in times of epidemic or pandemic. Literature also offers us ways to psychologically cope with the pandemic and how to live through the trying times. The experience of living through pestilence is shared in common in what we now call epidemic literature or pandemic literature. What is different about living through the pandemic is, I'm sure we are all familiar with this because we are living through the pandemic. So what is different about living through the pandemic is the sense of time, the sense of self, our relation with others, the sense of fear, and the growing sense of nihilism. I think this feeling of nihilism is most poignant in the words of Shivananda Adichie, who is one of my favorite authors, my favorite African-American writers. In her recent essay, Notes on Grief, I'm sure some of you must have read this essay. This was published, just recently, and it was written on the occasion of losing her father to the COVID-19 on the 10th of June 2020. I would like to quote a few lines from this essay. "I have mourned in the past, but only now I have touched grief hope. I am in the center of this churning, and I have become a maker of box, and inside this unbending walls, I cage my thoughts. I cannot think too much. I dare not think too deeply, or else I will be defeated. Not merely by pain, but by a drowning nihilism, a cycle of thinking. There's no point. What's the point? There's no point to anything." I'm sure we can relate with this, feeling that everything is pointless, everything is hopeless. Our social relations with others are affected very deeply during this trying time, during the present pandemic, because they are seen as potential, because others, the anonymous them are seen as potential threats to our survival. So, talking about them, when Defoe was talking about the Great Plague of 1665, he observes that this was a time when everyone's private safety lay so near them that they had no room to pity the distresses of others, for everyone had death, as it were, at his door, and many even in their families and knew not what to do or whither to fly. This, I say, took away all compassion. Self-preservation indeed appeared here to be the first law. Daniel Defoe, this was Daniel Defoe's work in the Journal of the Plague Year, published in 1772. So this was a time when, as the previous presenter had already mentioned, this was a time when people, went about with posies in their pockets, to which the well-known nursery rhyme, I'm sure all of us are familiar with, "Pocket full of posies," that you sing in school refers to. But though Malsawmliana has already mentioned, the connection between the plague and the pocket full of posies, I would also like to elaborate a little here. This nursery rhyme, as it goes, the line goes like ring a roses, pocket full of posies, husha basha, we all fall down. So as children, we used to sing this nursery rhyme without much, without much interest as to the origin of this nursery rhyme. Well, the fact is that people used to carry a pocket full of posies, which was a herb, during the bubonic plague of 1665, because it is said that a rosy rash, the malodorous rash that developed on the skin of the victims, was a symptom of the plague. And posies of herbs were carried as protection and also to ward off the stench of the disease, which then needed concealing with a pocket full of posies. And sneezing or coughing was a final fatal symptom, and that is when people fell down. We all fall down was exactly what happened. Now, the continuing appeal of Defoe's work lies in its relevance to the modern reader's experience of life. Defoe succeeded in capturing the essence of the psychological experience of urban life in the picture of urban crowding with, in his words, mighty throngs of people settling in London more than ever can be easily related with by the urban reader of today. And this throng of people with a pervasive sense of being overcrowded can rouse a sense of oppressive urban crowd. Defoe narrates, so the plague entered London when an incredible increase of people had happened. So you see dread, anxiety, alternations of hope and fear. This is very important. Alternations of hope and fear that beset the urban population, with the first threat of plague give way to a growing sense of insecurity as the plague worsens. Here, not only does Defoe talks about existence, but the existence of the plague, but also points out that these living conditions are the principal conditions which can easily be related to the modern experience of life. Defoe seems to demonstrate the idea that when the living circle of social relations break, that death threatens its victory. It is as if to say that missing the insomnia in na in pona allow one tina hianin victory atang zo the in asoi the omen therefore here it is as if to say that with the constant confrontation with the plague victims, the urban dwellers developed a sense of alienation and hostility to the other. Like I have already pointed out, the anonymous them, who became, because they had become potential threats to their safety. It is better to, avoid contact. So this fear of contact is what I think we all can relate to. Because as the narrator tells us in Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, those who kept themselves retired and reserved generally escaped the contagion. So people became more and more afraid of contact with others, which is, of course, as I say, a condition which is shared by all of us today. So a universal fear of human contact is the creeping moral and psychological malady in his in his journal, and it has become the psychological effect of the pandemic in our lives today. One of the anecdotes of the narrator here in the same book presents incomprehensible and irrationally destructive behavior generated by stress when he discusses when he narrates about some dissolute men in a tavern in an inn who confront a man who had just lost his entire family to the plague. They were not showing any sense of compassion to the poor man. And so it seemed as if people, lost all compassion, all social, feeling of oneness, love for the neighbors, and so on. Because it's like sailors or fishermen returning from the returning home after a storm. It somehow it makes them hardened inside and more hardened and stupid in a way. So So such a behavior of cruelty is heightened in the account of another incident in which a plague victim forcibly kisses a woman in the same book of Defoe. And this man, when after he forcibly kisses this woman, tells her that he has the plague, and why should she not have it as he, on page 160 of Defoe's journal. As one who has lived under the threat of pandemic, we can understand without question the emotions of the aggressors as well as the victims in these situations. Vandalism, acts of violence, superstition, medical incompetency are all familiar instances. Defoe's perceptions of the conditions of urban life and his awareness of the moral situation in which the individual is placed give his book immediacy to the modern reader, who has the sense of impending, apocalyptic event, and who is constantly in suspicion and dread of his fellow. So this dimension of Defoe's work is reflected in much that we find in Camus' treatment of qualities of modern life in La Peste, or the play translated in English. In each case, the life of the city under plague becomes paradigmatic for modern civilization. And I would like to discuss another popular work of fiction that uses the pandemic as its source, and that is, Dracula, which is, very popular among readers as well as among audience. And since it has been popularized on popular media, Bram Stoker's novel Dracula was published on the cusp of the 20th century in May of 1897, but his preparatory work for the novel takes us back to the 1870s, just as London was recovering and rebuilding from the devastating, nearly decade-long cholera epidemic of 1852 to 1860. I'm saying this because, though his novel was published in 1897, but the context takes us back to the 1870s, and during the time of the epidemic, and also the fact that a very important source of his novel Dracula is a letter from his mother, Charlotte Stoker, and the stories that he hears during his childhood when he was bedridden. He was a very sickly child, and so his mother used to tell him about the choleric pandemic that they were going through at that time during her childhood. So the novel Dracula begins with the transcript of the Haphazard Journal of a young Englishman by the name of Jonathan Harker, who narrates at first his captivity in the Transylvanian castle of Count Dracula. His narrative is carried over later by his fiancée Mina Murray when Harker's terror overtakes him and falls into a month-long swoon. Stoker has carried out a great deal of research on the mythology of vampirism, that resembles contagious illness. But most importantly, the novel's foregrounding of the investigation of the sickness can be connected, like I have already mentioned, to two important texts. One of which is, his mother's letter, and the other is his short story, which he had published in 1882, and it was called The Invisible Giant. Charlotte Stoker, his mother, used to narrate about the horrors of the choleric epidemic, and and in her 1873 letter to Bram, she tells him of the disease that was, I quote, said to have come from the east, rising out of the Yellow Sea, growing nearer and nearer until it was in Ireland. By twos and threes, our dead neighbors were carried away, unquote. I'm sure this strikes a very familiar chord with those of us who have experienced, many deaths, and especially, who have experienced death in the family, in the neighborhood, and the dead bodies of our neighbors being carried away, carried off. This is a very depressing moment. And so this letter, although Bram Stoker himself did not experience the pandemic or the epidemic, as it were, he used to hear, about the accounts from his mother, and he rather used to find it very interesting, and he would repeatedly ask her to narrate stories about the epidemic, in his sick bed. So this letter of his mother gives accounts of the horror of the 1852 epidemic, and it is extensively cited as an antecedent to the dark Gothic sensibility that gives rise to Dracula. So while narrating about the family's flight from Sligo, that was when that was a place where Stoker's mother used to live. So there, when narrating about the family's flight from Sligo during the pandemic that raged until it had carried off every member of the household in Sligo, which was a provincial town in Ireland, Charlotte recounts, in very few days, I quote, in very few days, the town became the place of the dead. Many people fled, and many of these were overtaken by the plague and died by the way. Most of the clergy of all denominations fled, and few indeed were instances in which the funeral service was spread over the dead. Now, with the plague raging, and finally, Charlotte's family decides to seek shelter with relatives in Ballyshannon. They embark on a stormy, miserable journey that serves as a forewarning of what lay before, in much the same way as the Gothic images of Harker's journey in Dracula, in the novel Dracula, to the castle of Dracula through the Transylvanian forest, foreshadows the terrors he is about to endure. So when the family arrives, as Charlotte Stoker says, they encounter a half-mad doctor, prefiguring the mad doctor and the mad patient, metaphor, patient pair of Stoker's early notes toward the novel. So, and also the story, The Invisible Giant, also uses the metaphor of the plague in the guise of an invisible giant, whom only Zaya, was the protagonist of that story, a young orphan girl, could see. Only Zaya could see the invisible giant, and all the rest of the inhabitants could not. But they all fell prey to this, pestilence brought forth by the invisible giant. Now, all the inhabitants of the unnamed town die, with only Zaya as the sole survivor. Now, this can also be read as, the reason for Zaya's survival is because of her innocence and deep compassion for humanity. Then we also come to one of the most important pandemic literature, which is Albert Camus' La Peste, published in 1947. In 1942, when he was drafting his book, which was to become one of the most acclaimed modern classics, Camus wrote, I quote, "Science explains what happens, not what is. Science explains what happens, not what is. The point of this assertion is to distinguish literature from the pedantries of scientific observation. In contrast to science, which tells us what happens, works, or unfolds as a function of time in mere sequence, and simply records observed events, literature shows us which is, within quotes, eternally, essentially a deeper and more permanent truth. Camus has been celebrated as, this is one of the reasons why Camus has been celebrated as most paradigmatic philosophical novelist of the 20th century and a reliable purveyor of deep universal human truths. So La Peste also, can be seen as an allegory of political violence through a chronicle of plague. So, besides meditating on the metaphysics of the epidemic, the book La Peste, or the Plague, chronicles a tale of an existential crisis told from the perspective of distant, omniscient interpreter, later on only revealed to us as Dr. Hripui, teaching its witnesses and readers about what is, and more, which unfolds from multiple perspectives. The difficulty of understanding what went down in the absence of reliable knowledge of what it in fact is. The plague itself, for example, remains unnamed until well after its arrival in the Algerian town or city of Oran. And it could be identified only by an elderly doctor who recognizes the disease from his days in China. Now, but also comes the fact that the plague, when it first struck the people of Oran, people were hesitant to recognize it or to believe it, and this also includes the group of doctors, the team of doctors, or the team of administrators. They were simply not ready to accept that it was the plague, because it was thought to be, the plague was thought to be removed from the Occidental. It was thought to be, the plague was given a somewhat racial color, because of the fact that when one of the doctors said that it was no longer there. It's unthinkable. He said, Castle, one of the senior doctors, Castle, he says that he was simply not ready to accept the fact that it was the plague which was ravaging the Algerian town of Oran, because he said that, I quote, it disappeared from the Occident. It's unthinkable. Everyone knows it has ceased to appear in Western Europe. Now, this highlights the ways in which, the imaginary of the disease, not just what happens, but where and to whom, is far from neutral, but rather, it is cultural, historical, and discursive. So, so Camus is very relevant, and his novel, The Plague, is very relevant in today's world of despair, since it chimes, mostly because it chimes in with the spirit of our times. And The Plague is at another level about the collapsing of beliefs, the time of collapsing beliefs, and on the other extreme, the time of fervent belief in religious miracle. And this form of epidemic thinking renders the globe a single corporeal entity, which is perpetually vulnerable to afflictions. And here, I think it is very important to note so far that, the presumed totality of this epidemic condition, its potential to turn apocalyptic, makes all measure in its prevention possible, makes all counter-epidemic violence an unquestioned remedy, which is, of course, highly, debatable. And instances of unfair system of administration has been time and again pointed out, as in the lockdown period of during the first visitation of COVID-19 in 2020. There was this question which Arundhati Roy had powerfully pointed out in her essay, pandemic as a portal. The condition of the migrants and the daily wage earners and the condition of the poor has been pointed out time and again. So, also the fact that pestilences and wars have been experienced by human beings through the ages. It's not something which is extraordinary to our times. But it is also true that one can never get used to it. And when it strikes, it always takes us unawares. From even in 1772 novel, as we have discussed, in Defoe's and in Boccaccio's 1353 collection of stories, Decameron, or in The Pest, as Camus observes, the unpreparedness by which people receive this pestilence or the scourge seems to be common to in all ages, and it is very relevant today, given the context, given the present context. As Camus has observed very clearly, there have been as many plagues in the world as there have been wars. Yet plagues and wars always find people equally unprepared, which you find on the page 30 of La Peste. And there is also the unwillingness to believe it, whether it be war or a pandemic. There is always the difficulty for the reality to sink in, with all its terror. Maybe because we feel safer to ignore it, to doubt its presence perhaps, or at another level to see it as a concoction, or at worst a conspiracy. Or is it because of a staunch humanism, like the people of Oran, who, like anybody else in the world, as Albert Camus narrates, refuse to, I quote, believe in pestilence because a pestilence does not have human dimension. So people tell themselves that it is unreal, that it is a bad dream which will end, unquote. But Camus reminds that it does not always end. And from one bad dream to the next, it is people who end. Humanities, first of all, because they have not prepared themselves. The people of Oran also were like any people of the world. They were, disbelieving it. They continued with their business, with making arrangements for travel and holding opinions, as much as we do now. So the truth that pestilences are part of human history as much as wars are does not seem to make us any wiser either. Dr. Ruo, the narrator in the past, recollects that the 30 or so great plagues recorded in history had caused nearly 100 million deaths. And he recalls the plague of Constantinople, which, according to Procopius, claimed 10,000 victims in one day. Then he asks himself this question, this very poignant question. But what are 100 million deaths? When one has fought a war, one hardly knows anymore what a dead person is. And if a dead man has no significance unless one has seen him dead, 100 million bodies spread through history are just a mist drifting through the imagination. Page 31. The inability to grasp the magnitude of disaster for the 100 million anonymous style, I quote, anonymous style of human dead bodies changes only when the shroud of anonymity is lifted. This psychological experience is not particular to the 20th century Europe. The anonymous file Camus talked about seemed to strike a familiar note with the anonymous heap of bodies found on the shores of the Ganga, telecast in all news channels in our world today. The scene described in Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague here is no different. When he says London might well be said to be all in fear. As we pass the street, that it was enough to pierce the stoutest heart in the world to hear them. Now that was the scene on the first part of the visitation of the day. For Defoe narrates, towards the later end, men's hearts were hardened, and death was so always before their eyes that they did not so much concern themselves for the loss of their friends, expecting that they themselves should be summoned the next hour. Defoe writes, they were, I quote, they were as it were alarmed and unalarmed again. And they several times till it began to be familiar to them, and that even when it appeared violent, yet seeing it did not presently spread into the city, the people began to take courage and to be, as I may say, a little hard. So as the plague progresses, all that is left is concern for oneself. That took away all compassion, self-preservation, indeed appeared here to be the first law. It is this compassion that Giovanni Boccaccio so ardently calls for in his 14th century collection of tales, Decameron, which is considered a masterpiece of classical Italian prose. He, writing against the backdrop of the bubonic plague pandemic, which occurred in Afro-Eurasia from 1346 to 1343, that visited Florence in 1348, Boccaccio stresses on the need for compassion in times of distress. It is an interesting opening which Boccaccio makes in his Decameron, when he says, a kindly thing it is to have compassion of the afflicted. But it is also interesting, by the implication that compassion, though it is a necessary human quality, is not something that all humans possess. Boccaccio is a 14th century writer, and there are not many ways we of the 21st century can relate with the Middle Age insofar as society, politics, education, outlooks, and our overall lifestyle go. But the one thing that we can relate to is the experience of family, as the philosopher is writing, because human emotions haven't changed, nor our helplessness and lack of knowledge for the cure. The medical fraternity seems as much helpless as they were in the 14th century. In the introduction of Boccaccio's Decameron, where he mentions about the cemeteries which were so full that they, in the later part of the play, they had to dig pits where the corpses had to be, like they were dumped into these pits which were filled. So here we see a description of a pandemic that struck human civilization 673 years ago, but much does not seem to have changed. Decameron is about how people try to deal with the monotony and the misery of the plague as it ravages the city of Florence. And here, the stories are a collection of stories which are told by 10 young people who were seeking refuge in a country house to tell each other stories. So this is one of the ways by which they try to come to terms with the misery of the plague, and how they try to restructure their normal everyday lives, which have been suspended due to the pandemic. And the storytelling strategy is one of the ways to cope with the time, which is essential for psychological balance and psychic survival. And in a way, this is what we are doing right now. In conclusion, let us be reminded of the need for compassion that has been the common theme in almost all the works that we have discussed so far. Compassion is linked to empathy, and empathy is central to literature. How can you relate to a work of literature, let alone the voices of characters in it, unless you empathize with others? After all, they are by other people about others. So it is little wonder then that pandemic has tended to evoke literary and cultural responses. And pandemic has always been and will be a source of huge spate of literary work, and it is not over yet. So thank you all. I conclude my presentation. Over to the organizers.
Okay. Zothanchhingi kanlom hle maya paper internet po an chalo do na mo kan tia ma se presentation chu ngai thak thein na ma paper chatak ngai to na result tak mai mai tha kanlom hle mai Zothanchhingi chunga lom thu Dr. Zothanchhingi chunga lom thu kan soye ikhan zan ina kan paper ngai thak tur ti chu kan lo ngai khazota Zothanchhingi kanin world classical literature text ho novel Daniel Defoe novel te tin Boccaccio short stories collection ti le thil dang tang pang khanin pandemic le literature in pung kai na kha aron tar lang ve thunga ngai nom takania literature te hi open hemi Hripui le literature kan te hi mitin huwa pania ramri khamma nei lawa hun le munin adai dang tak tak te lawa tor in ang tor thumun kan lo ni ti alan na thule la te ka mishing te in nem na enge min ti thamwang tu le kan ril ru kai shwai dik tu launa lakate poinga motizong takwa min chan suak thei tu kha ani khotlang nun pung hun sang sanga shi lo leng to ten enge adong song tu ram in rel bol dan le khotlang fu tok lo thil te khatiang angkha novel mangte character mangte khan an tar langani kha ngai nom tak mai na ron present kan lom le mai ti kha ka soi the tok ni sela chuan zona le chan na kha chat box lama khanin azo theye kan tia zona hi panni aluta enge pakhat phe chu kan resource person hian in lo chang fel diam to a zona pakhat ro kha chu lo ma kha khala chan lo ni in ka sha a engpo ni sela mi audience ten participants ten kan lo shat lan be tan te po chareng renga zona pakhat an lo in chan to sa hi chat box kha kan lo enrek lo takin kan tar lang thawanga Hripui le enghar sadne emolo theng to chin hi Mizo literature huanga engjon ro pian nge hausak pui bera ishiat tikha ania zona chu Professor Malsawmliana chan na chu poetry hi ani la mang hian an hun ton hi an puang chuak na saber ni in lang ti in an lo in chang fel to ani chuan zona dang alo lut le a Professor Malsawmliana tan ania post pandemic boom anti mai Hripui leng zo a mason na chi sang sang ron zuang an soi chin hi mizo te hun ton to a hian a thleng ve in I mu em ti kha zona omboka kan resource person kan so manga usom khan achang duem chula tilem lo ani chuan ama thu ni sela
long zona hi ne post pandemic boom an ti mai Hripui leng zo ma sona chi sang thang ron zo an soi thin te mizo te hun ton to hen a thleng ve ni muem ti lai khania history kan soyang khanin man lai chuan Hripui leng te hi engemo awanga an เชียนี่แต่ปงไอ้นั่นแต่ปงเวทีนะที่กันหุ่นมาสามตัวมาแต่ส่วนสิปุยเลี้ยงวางข้านินอันเป็นแต่ไม่ทีนะขวดแต่ข้าอันส้นทีนั่นนี่ติกันทีอ่ะซึ่งแต่ชูอันมาส้นนะอันนี้แหละนี่เราชูกระเฮ็ดช่วงเมื่อเราว่ามาเราชูข้างข้าสิปุยเลี้ยงวางหาสันนะเลอเลียนจัวทิลเข่งเตอันนี้เดือดทีนะตินข้าตุนนายฮัมมดันปีเรตกันที่ข้านินทว่าขันใดพวกข้านินสิปุยเลี้ยงข้าคริสเตียนที่ติดตัวนักเจล่าข้านินอันละลินคริสเตียนเขาอินรำห้วยติดถินอุระข้าวางชีข้ารุนเลี้ยงอันนี้ติดข้าอันนั้นสวยชูวางส่วนก่อนปุยสันสกุลปรุกขันอันนั้นเปรมแต่เจล่าก็ติงขันตุนมาชวนชีอันเลียนเฮียนอันขั้วข้านินจุยนัดล่างนี้ไงเราวางอินอันเปรมเวลเดฟฟูชินันนี่ช่วงเตส่วนอินโทมัทธาร์เตปนันล่างติขันบุลันจันทัดโซเลเซลชูวางอินสิปุยเลี้ยงวางงั้นนี่ชื่อจะฟังมาสอนนะจวงอันเตียงชิกาชูที่ตั้มตักชูเอาเราไม่เทกเจียงตุกละว่าทุกการเทียบเทียนชวนตุนมาชวนมิโซเต็นสิปุยเลี้ยงโจเฮียนินอันขวข้าเองโมอวางเทงเดียงไงวางอินอันขวอันเราสนะอันเปรมสันทรินที่ไรกัชูอาเจียงอินกัเสีย
อารมณ์มันได้ไหมค่ะที่การอาเจียงถูกขัดเลยโจตุกกันเราง่ายค่ะอังจูโจเนี่ยดังฮีลู่ต่อเล่มหรือว่าจานี่นะให้ตัวเพ่งอินดาร์สวมริดอนตัวตุนหุ่นเพ่งยัน participants จะจวงจะสมริดอนกันแล้วมันนี่นี่จะว่าจงอารมณ์ทุกกันสวยจวนที่ตัวมาอินกันอินมังชามาอินกันสวยนนเลยดูจุนักตุกจานะเตนักติบจานะเตที่ขานินเปเปอร์ไงน้องตักข้างไงทักเลยดูข้ากันนั่นเองนักตุกจานะยันโปรแกรมกันลงหัวตัวไม่เทีย Professor H. Vanlalnghaka ATC เนี่ยนะจังเต Professor Vanlalnghaka เนี่ยหูมั่วตัวจงนี่ก็สวยตัวไม่เนี่ยนะจังเต็นเปเปอร์ไงน้องตักกันละไงขัดตัวนี่ identity จงจังมิโซจงจังเตตินสากวานะชิปุยนะห้องดักเตกันละไงขัดตัวนี่สุวรรณจวนจานีนะนี่ให้ webinar ชิมตุจงเตนักจานเล่นักติดจานะพอลงทุนเซลตัวรินกันหันเปลี่ยนเชื่อว่าจานีนะฮิอันกัน Keynote speaker เตกัน patron Dr. Professor H. Lalthanzara เตกัน resource person Professor Malsawmliana เล่ Dr. Zothanchhingi Khiangte เล่ participant จงเตอินสบายจงลงทุกให้ webinar โหลดตินนะตัวรินจานโหลดเล่ตัวรับพยานินเนี่ยที่ตบสวดลางอิลาติค่ะกันดูอันนี้ตินcertificate พอฮิจันทุนได้feedback form ค่ะเป็กสวดตัวนี้ที่คันจันอินะกัน webinar program ตัวเราจะต่อจะว่าจงกันมามังชามุตุยเวกเลย
เอาเลย
มังชาเวกเลยกันลมเล่ไหม
น้องชาวเลยไหม
บริกันซ้อมเจ้าวันนี้
หลวมแน่ไหม